In a peaceful Sydney neighbourhood, a family's home was vandalised with hateful messages, and inside, 3 bodies lay in pools of blood. But thankfully, police had an eyewitness, not to the murder, but to the intruder escaping. And that would lead to who wanted this family dead with crystal clarity. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. I upload on Mondays and Thursdays, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. You can access all episodes ad-free and early on Patreon. It was early evening on July 10th, 2001, winter in Sydney. The sky had dimmed to a kind of soft, cold grey, and the streets of North Ryde were settling into their usual quiet night. This was a family suburb, tidy hedges, quiet driveways, and it was the kind of place where dinner was usually already on the table by 6. Emily Luna hadn't planned to visit her sister that evening. It was a spontaneous stop, one of those casual drop-in moments that are normal for close family members or friends. Emily had her young son with her, and it seems like they were just nearby. It made sense to swing by Collins Street and say hello. As they pulled up to number 6, everything seemed normal at first. The house looked exactly how it always did. A neat brick home with drawn blinds and a trimmed front lawn. A green Ford Festiva parked right outside. Still, she climbed out of the car with her son and approached the front door. As she got closer, she paused. Something made her hesitate. She leaned slightly towards the frosted glass in the front door and tried to look inside, and that's when she saw movement. Just beyond the glass, standing still in the hallway, was a figure. Someone was inside. She could just make out a silhouette wearing a baseball cap and what looked like a long coat. The outline was hazy but unmistakable. Someone was right there, watching her from the other side. Emily knew this house. She knew what that hallway looked like, and more than that, she had a feeling. You know, if you've ever had that feeling, then you will just know, but it's that gut feeling that sometimes makes you do things that in any other situation might not make sense, but in this particular moment, Emily turned around, grabbed her son, and walked away. It was nothing dramatic, no running or screaming, just a simple, instinctive decision to get back in her car and leave. And that decision, that barely conscious moment of unease, might have saved her life. Because hours later, police would swarm that house as they discovered that house was the gruesome site of a triple homicide. At around 11:45 p.m, a distressed call came through to emergency services. The caller said he'd just come home to a horrific scene. His entire family was dead. Blood everywhere, and he was panicked and emotional and overwhelmed. The caller was Seth Gonzales. Paramedics and police responded immediately, and within minutes, officers arrived at 6 Collins Street and were met outside the front by Seth, who was visibly distraught. He told them what he'd seen, what was inside. When they stepped into the house, even the most experienced officers were shaken. The front hallway showed signs of a struggle. Items were knocked over, a faint smell of blood in the air, and it was so very quiet. And that's when they found the first body, Teddy Gonzales, Seth's own father and Emily's brother-in-law. He was just inside the front door, clearly dead from significant injuries. He hadn't made it far. From the pattern and the placement of his wounds, it looked like he'd been attacked the moment he stepped into the house. Not far from him, in the downstairs area, was Loiva, Seth's mother and Emily's own sister. She'd been stabbed multiple times. Her handbag had spilled onto the floor, its contents were kind of scattered all over the place, and her shoes were still on, almost like she hadn't even had time to settle in after work before she was ambushed. Upstairs was the most brutal scene of all. 18-year-old Claudine was in her bedroom. Her body had been subjected to a level of violence that shocked even hardened investigators. She'd been bludgeoned, strangled, and stabbed, a horrifying trio of deadly wounds. Her room was still tidy, there were books on the desk, the bed had been made, and a red jacket partially covered her body, draped across her almost like an afterthought. There was no sign that she'd even had time to fight back, and the attack on her seemed super personal. When I read those details, I immediately thought rage, pure hatred. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no smashed locks. In fact, nothing in the house had been ransacked. Expensive jewellery sat untouched in drawers, and electronics were left in plain sight. Even the family's financial documents were stacked neatly in the study. If this was a robbery, it wasn't like any robbery police had seen before. Then there was the graffiti that I mentioned at the start. Jarring, hateful, and deliberate. Someone had spray painted racist slurs on the walls in bold blue lettering. Investigators immediately saw that this was likely a racially motivated crime. The spray paint had dripped in places, but it was still fresh, still tacky to the touch. Police found the discarded spray can inside the home. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't tossed outside. Perhaps the murderer had left it there in a panic, forgotten to take it with them, or maybe they just didn't care. And then came this wild discovery. In the upstairs bathroom, investigators found a towel that was lying on the sink, and it was damp. And none of the victims were wet or seemed like they'd had a shower any time shortly before the attacks, but there were water spots on the tiles in the bathroom, and there was steam residue still on the mirror. Someone had cleaned themselves off not too long before police had been called. But how? How would an intruder have taken the time to shower? The investigators hoped they'd be able to find some kind of physical forensic evidence from where the killer or killers had escaped from the house. Some kind of indication of how they'd gone or even how they'd gotten inside. Maybe, I don't know, tyre tracks or something. But they didn't find anything. No tyre tracks, no distinguishable footprints, and there were no blood trails outside. Whoever had done this had entered and exited cleanly. When I realised that, I thought maybe this was a hit, maybe some kind of professional job, but the shower thing, that really threw me off, because how many hit men, hit women, hit anyone, how many of them do you know that has ever taken a shower before leaving? What investigators did find was a baseball cap lying in the hallway, not far from where Teddy's body was found. Investigators weren't sure if that had been dropped in a struggle or perhaps deliberately left behind. They weren't going to take anything for granted though, and they weren't making any assumptions at this point. On the kitchen counter, there were traces of blood that had been partially wiped. Smears, inconsistent in direction, again suggesting that the killer had tried to clean, just enough to kind of slow things down. And then came the forensics. Swabs were taken from every surface. DNA samples, fibre lifts, latent prints. It all went into the lab. But nothing looked immediately promising. The DNA that did come back belonged to the family or to people who had every reason to be inside the house. No unidentified fingerprints, no foreign hair strands, and no foreign footprints. This pointed to someone who had done this professionally, or at the very least, someone who knew how to cover their tracks. In the master bedroom, forensics found a small amount of blue paint, the same shade as the graffiti, and it was smeared along the edge of the sink. It was odd to find that paint in the bathroom, but investigators flagged it for testing. They saw the colour similarity, but they just needed to check it was actually the same as the graffiti paint. Maybe if it was, it could help them build a more accurate timeline of the killer's movements. News of what happened at 6 Collins Street spread quickly. Within the hour, word began to ripple out beyond North Ryde, and soon neighbours were emerging from their homes, some in slippers, others clutching jackets, but all of them with the same stunned look of disbelief. This was a peaceful, residential pocket of suburban Sydney, the kind of place where kids rode bikes in cul-de-sacs and people nodded to each other whilst taking out the bins. The Gonzaleses were known in the area. One neighbour told reporters that she'd been watching television when the street began to flash with emergency lights. Another said she heard nothing, no screaming, no bangs, nothing out of the ordinary, and that's what made it more chilling. Whatever had happened inside of that house, it had been silent. By morning, news vans lined the road, cameras perched at the ready. Photographers leaned against fences, their lenses pointed at the dark two-storey home, now with its perimeter completely covered in crime scene tape. Detectives, meanwhile, held a press conference just outside the home. A plainclothes police officer stepped forward and read a prepared statement. 3 people, a man, a woman and a teenage girl, had just been found deceased inside the property. The son, aged 20, had discovered them and was fully cooperating with police. When asked whether it was a robbery gone wrong, the officer said, quote, "It's too early to speculate, but the nature of the scene raises serious concerns." What wasn't shared with the public yet, but was the immediate focus behind the scenes, was that graffiti. Those spray-painted slurs in big block lettering that was scrawled across the walls inside the home. Anti-Asian, racial, cruel, the kind of language meant to infuriate and disrespect. The spray paint was not an afterthought. It had been deliberately placed where it would be seen, in the hallway, along one wall in the lounge, and again in the stairwell. The placement seemed intentional, not haphazard. Someone wanted to be heard. This led police to a theory that gained early traction: a hate crime. It wasn't impossible. In fact, Australia at the time was facing increasing discourse around immigration, identity and race. Tensions, while subtle, had been simmering. Was it possible that the Gonzaleses had been targeted because of their ethnicity? Absolutely, it was possible, but was that the primary reason? At the time, Australia was in the grip of rising cultural tension, and there was this national conversation that was fraught with questions about immigration and identity and belonging. And no, we're not talking about America in 2025. We are talking about Oz in the early 2000s. The 2001 federal election had just seen the government re-elected on a platform focused heavily on border protection and national security. Policies that stirred xenophobic undercurrents across the country. Media coverage often framed immigration as a threat to the, quote, Australian way of life, which kind of fueled fear and definitely ignited division. In reality, by 2001, immigrants made up nearly 25% of Australia's population, with Asian Australians representing one of the fastest growing communities. Racial prejudice and discrimination remained super there, with reports from the time showing that nearly 20% of Asian Australians had experienced racial harassment or abuse in the years leading up to the murders. So, when police discovered hateful racial slurs spray-painted on that wall of the Gonzales' family home, it seemed to confirm that terrifying possibility. And when the media learned about this, they quickly seized upon that story, amplifying the shock and grief with every single broadcast. And detectives began following that line. They reached out to hate crime specialists. They canvassed the area for reports of any recent racial incidents, threats or harassment, and they pulled over CCTV from surrounding streets, looking for signs of unfamiliar vehicles or perhaps people lurking around the property in the days prior. Internally, officers were kind of talking about whether the messaging on the walls had come before the murders or after. That was important because it would perhaps tell them, was this part of a broader ideology-driven attack, or had it been added after the fact, maybe even as a distraction? Forensics tested the spray paint and they logged its chemical composition and origin. The team began sourcing nearby stores to check sales of blue aerosol cans, and they needed to basically see if they could find a receipt or a buyer on camera. Now, nothing turned up immediately, and this is back in the early 2000s, so I mean, I know certain parts of investigations can feel slow or frustratingly don't get done immediately, but back then things took even longer and they cost even more money, so it was always going to take some time. And meanwhile, a killer was still out there. Family, friends began to arrive at the scene, most in disbelief, most breaking down in tears. A growing pile of flowers appeared outside the house. Someone left a note, quote, "We'll miss you in class. You were always so nice to me." By the end of the second day, major newspapers had picked up the story. Quote, "Family of 3 found dead in North Ryde home, son discovers scene. Triple tragedy rocks Sydney suburb." Hate crime. Police investigate shocking graffiti at murder scene. Neighbours described the family as quiet, kind and well integrated into the community. Quote, "They were just a normal, lovely family, always polite, always friendly. You'd never imagine anything like this happening. It was such a shock. I still can't believe something so awful happened right here in our neighbourhood." Online forums started speculating, some wildly, but most people agreed on one thing. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, because whoever did this, as we know, had vanished without a trace. Back at the station, officers were working round the clock. Door knocks, timeline mapping, phone logs, interviews with neighbours, friends and extended family. In many ways, it was a clean scene, too clean. There was so little physical evidence of a break-in or any stranger's presence that it had really stumped the investigating team. What stood out more than anything was the precision of the staging, the intact valuables, the lack of struggle at the points of entry. This was not a botched burglary, it was a planned attack. It wasn't even clear if the killer had broken in at all, and so detectives began to consider the possibility that this was someone known to the family, or someone who could walk up to the door, knock on, and then be let inside for some reason. Someone who could walk in without raising alarms. And yet, in that moment, there were no suspects, no weapons, no eyewitnesses, and only the racial motive, which, if that's all you're going off, your suspect list is gonna be large. Now, of course, 2 of the most important witnesses were Emily, the aunt who came to the house and got that gut feeling to turn around and leave, and the son, Seth, who was the eldest child and who had actually been the person to find his family and call emergency services. Seth described how he'd spent most of his day at his parents' legal office working alongside them before returning home to discover the scene. He'd arrived home to find all of his family already dead. But the investigating officer found something out when they were taking a statement from Emily, something that would change the entire direction of the murder investigation. We know Emily had arrived unexpectedly at the house that evening, hoping to check in on the family. We also know she saw that green Ford car parked outside. That car was Seth's, and he wasn't inside it. When Seth gave his version of events to police, he said he had pulled up to the house around that time, but he stayed in the car because it was raining too heavily to get out. But Emily knew without question it hadn't been raining, and Seth hadn't been sitting inside of his car. She had looked inside and she'd seen it was empty. The timing of this was well before Seth called the emergency services, and this single detail would become one of the first glaring cracks in his story. A silent but damning piece of evidence that haunted investigators and set the stage for everything that followed. Seth ended up telling police that earlier that day, his family had been involved in a heated altercation with a group of strangers who had been aggressively tailgating their car. The family felt threatened, and the encounter had left them shaken. He said that after finding his family brutally murdered inside the house, his immediate reaction had actually been to chase the intruders down the street. According to his own account, he'd smashed through the garage door and chased after the intruders, desperate to catch them after what they'd done to his family. But police wanted more details, and as soon as they asked him to fully explain what he meant, what had happened, his story began to unravel, to say the least. Investigators quickly realised that the physical reality of the situation did not, and simply put, could not, match Seth's version. The garage door was still locked and solid, it's literally a door. It was impossible for him to simply burst through it like some sort of bloody cartoon. And they even tested it out for themselves, timing how long it would have taken. And basically put, that analysis showed that Seth's ability to run at the speed he actually would have had to run at, it just wasn't possible. It was like what you'd think of pitching in a writer's room for a Mission Impossible, and they'd be like, actually, no, we are going to need to get him on a truck or something because it's just not realistic. The chase he described was impossible. His claim clashed with the evidence on the ground, and this was the first real suggestion that the supposed intruders were maybe, just maybe, nothing more than a fabricated story, a desperate attempt to deflect suspicion. When police dug into that detail about Seth's car being there way earlier than he said, and him very clearly not being inside, Seth offered an alibi. He said, yeah, he had been sitting in the car at 6 p.m. waiting, but then he'd set off to Blacktown to visit a friend named Raf DeLeon. But in the end, after driving around for some time, he actually couldn't find Raf's home. Okay, my question then is, if you don't have the address, then where do you think you're heading to? Anyway, he said that after he had searched for a little while, he gave up and returned to his car and stayed there for a time, later making plans to meet another friend, Sam DeCillo, at 8 p.m. But that alibi didn't hold up. Shocking. Police interviewed Mariella Pavone, a neighbour who'd seen Seth's car outside the house. Her timing didn't match Seth's story. The details just didn't add up, and more inconsistencies piled up. And then another bombshell. Within days of the murder, the police uncovered another unsettling detail. Seth had made an appointment with his father's accountant. He had a question. How much money did they have? On the surface, if we didn't know everything we just learned in the last 5 minutes, it could have seemed like an innocent question. I don't know, maybe for funeral costs or something. I don't know, I wouldn't be asking those questions. I'd be in a pit of sadness and despair, to be honest. But anyway, these are the questions that Seth asked. And in the context of everything else unfolding, it certainly piqued the investigators' suspicions even more so. They couldn't understand why someone, barely days after losing their entire family in such a horrific way, would be concerned with finances. Anyway, Seth was unfazed by this, and he was unfazed by the fact that his alibi just wasn't true and could be proven as that, and so he offered a second alibi. He had lied to them, but there was a good reason. According to him, after leaving his father's office before 4 p.m, he returned home but stayed outside, never stepping inside the house. Then, he claimed he took a taxi to Chatswood, where he visited an address and spent time with a sex worker. After that, he caught a taxi home, again avoided entering the house, and later drove to meet his pal, Sam DeCillo. The investigating officers checked in with the taxi driver, who did initially admit that, yeah, he'd taken Seth on that route, that journey that night. And this did kind of throw officers, because they weren't sure how he could have been in a taxi at the same time as the murders, and they were kind of trying to work out this timing, because it completely threw any theory that they were working on out of the question. But investigators really weren't buying it, because they managed to find out that the sex worker Seth mentioned wasn't even working that day. And so they went back to the taxi driver and questioned him again. And under pressure, he admitted that he'd actually never taken Seth that night. In fact, Seth had paid him just to say that he had. And on top of all of this, investigators had gotten some of the forensic results back from the crime scene analysis. Blue spray paint was found on the sleeves of Seth's clothing. Forensic tests confirmed it was the exact same type of paint used for the hateful graffiti on the walls, the slurs he claimed were left by intruders. Oh, and also, This is a bit of a side note, but very important and kind of unbelievable. So when they were investigating the murders, they just so happened to stumble across something that turned out to be, potentially an indication of just how premeditated this all was. So they'd obviously searched through all of Seth's personal belongings during the search. And during one of those searches, investigators found evidence that Seth had managed to get hold of a toxic plant. It was super well known for its poisonous properties. Well, apparently, I obviously didn't know this, but as plants go, if you've got this plant, you're likely to know its potential to be extremely dangerous. It's not just like some obscure shrub in a garden pot. This was Abrus precatorius, which definitely sounds like a spell, but it is a plant. It's more commonly known as the rosary pea. It has abrin in it, a toxin significantly more potent than ricin. Don't know if you remember this. We've spoken about ricin before. I think it was one of the very early episodes I did on Georgi Markov, way back at the beginning of Red Rum. He was injected into his calf with an umbrella, shooting pellet of ricin. Anyway, so abrin is more powerful with that, and even a tiny dose can kill a full-grown adult in not very much time at all. This isn't the kind of thing someone has lying around by accident. What made this discovery even more disturbing was that just weeks before the murders, Loiva Gonzales, so Seth's mother, had suddenly gotten ill and no one knew why. She'd complained of severe stomach pain and symptoms consistent with poisoning. But at the time, obviously no one suspected she might have been poisoned by her own son, and so there was no real investigation into it, I suppose. After Seth's arrest, police traced online search histories and purchases back to him, including research into various poisons and their effects. The fact he had the plant, alongside the digital trail, strongly suggested that Seth had been exploring non-violent ways to harm his family before resorting to brutal violence. Prosecutors would later argue that his original plan was to quietly poison his mother and possibly other members of his family with the intent to inherit the estate without suspicion. But when that method failed, either because maybe the dose wasn't strong enough or his mum recovered too quickly, after that, he allegedly moved on to something far more direct. But the plant and the intent it suggested became a key piece of evidence in showing just how far back that planning might have gone. It wasn't until June 2002, so nearly a full year since the murders of Teddy, Loiva and Claudine, that things took a significant shift. Investigators discovered something entirely unrelated to the murders themselves, but very disturbing and extremely telling. Police had found an old letter. It had been sent to a major food company in 2001, claiming their products had been poisoned in retaliation for the mistreatment of employees. It read, "3 of your products have been poisoned. By now, they are on supermarket shelves. This is what you get for treating employees like garbage. Good luck finding infected cans before someone dies. Go to hell." This wasn't just a side note, it was critical because it revealed a pattern of deception, manipulation, and fakery that predated the murders. Police now believed Seth may have originally planned to poison his own family, and this letter was part of a broader, earlier strategy to kind of create external enemies and basically to mislead investigators. On June 13th, 2002, police arrested Seth at his Chatswood apartment and charged him with 3 counts of murder, along with 1 count of threatening product contamination. That last charge was the final straw, a clear link between the poisoning attempts and the man now suspected of slaughtering his entire family. We all know that when you're arrested, your fingerprints are entered into the National Police Database, and when they did Seth's fingerprints, it led to that food tampering letter match. The reaction from the family was heartbreaking. Seth's grandmother, Amelita, and his aunt, Emily, the same aunt who obviously walked up to the front door whilst he was inside the house, they spoke publicly about their fear of him. Seth applied for bail shortly after the arrest, but it was denied. The judge ruled he posed an extreme flight risk. And then, in another twist, just 2 months after being taken into custody, Seth filed a motion to access his parents' estate to fund his legal defence. It was denied. Come on, man. And so he was going to be defended by legal aid. What had once been a brutal triple murder of a beloved family was now being viewed through a much darker lens. The smiling son who had sung at their funeral. And yes, actually, I've just got to pause here to explain this bit. So Seth fancied himself as a bit of a celebrity, and not like locally known. I mean, he thought he was an undiscovered global pop icon. Seth wasn't just going to study law like his parents wanted. He was going to be a star, a singer, a model, a triple threat, heartthrob who would obviously become world famous once the universe stopped being so rude and noticed him. And he really did think that the world was against him, and that was the only reason he hadn't, quote, made it. To help his inevitable stardom happen, he literally made a fan page about himself. He built a website page pretending it was run by a friend, gushing about how hot and amazing he was, and it wasn't subtle. So the page is still up if you want to view it, wouldn't recommend. And I'm just going to quote a few bits from it. Seffi is 101% male, capital letters. Trust me, hee-ha, 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 aha, he-ah-he-ha. Cute at some model shoot thingy with friends. There were pictures of him posing in tuxedos in front of cars, posing on piles of girls. I'm using the word girls because they all look under 18, but I don't actually know. And also, Seth had invented a fake fangirl who was in love with him. I'm not sure what she was going to be a fan of, but alas, she was. And later on, he would claim that she died in 9/11. Oh, goodness, there's just a lot to this case and this man. He is a man, I suppose. So now fast forward to the funeral of his family, and he stood front and centre, pulled out a microphone and started singing his own original song. And the lyrics are wild. Quote, "I never thought I'd lose you. Now I'm standing here alone, trying to be strong." The wild part is, it actually worked for a little while. Obviously, before he was arrested, people felt sorry for him. He was young and polite and apparently in unimaginable pain. And he milked it too. He told the media that his life was in danger and he needed to hire a bodyguard. He even asked reporters to pay him for an interview, like his family hadn't just been murdered, but he was, I don't know, trying to be some elusive pop star doing a press tour. When journalist Cara Lawrence finally sat down with him, he rambled about break-ins, death threats, those alleged tailgaters, and mystery killers. Anyway, meanwhile behind the scenes, police were working overtime. They had been recording calls, pulling computer histories, quietly assembling a picture of this man who wasn't just delusional, but he was very clearly dangerous. They did have a slight problem though. The murder weapons, so that was knives and a baseball bat, and also any blood-stained clothing, none of those were ever found. It was, we know, as if someone had meticulously wiped away those most incriminating traces, and the murder weapons and clothing were also gone. That investigation went on for 11 more long months. For over a year, Seth wove this really just elaborate maze of lies and false leads and, of course, fabricated alibis, all designed to mislead police and to escape justice. But the detectives were relentless and they were determined. Piece by piece, timeline by timeline, every single detail was examined and verified. In April of 2004, so almost 3 years after the triple murder, Seth Gonzales stood trial for the murders of his father, his mother, and his teenage sister. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, family, friends, spectators who had followed every twist of the investigation. By this point, the prosecution had a towering stack of evidence, a timeline that just fell apart under scrutiny, and these alibis that changed over and over again, as we know, and a trail of increasingly bizarre lies that went from, I don't know, like awkward to just alarming. Seth, however, pleaded not guilty. The prosecution's case was clear. Seth had murdered his family in cold blood, motivated by greed, humiliation, and the desire for a clean slate. And all of the elements of what the prosecution said he did were laid out, and especially in terms of like premeditation. So we know the poisoning attempt, the false alibis, of which he had 2 different ones. Oh, and I forgot to say just about his alibis. The second alibi, the one where he said that he had been with a sex worker, he actually said at one point that he never paid the sex worker because she said she didn't want paying because he was just that good. Oh, Seth, that's not how sex workers work. We of course know that she hadn't even worked that day, and we know the taxi driver was of course paid off to lie. Each new explanation just made Seth look more and more guilty. If he was innocent, then none of this made sense at all. And it didn't stop there. The prosecution also played thousands of secretly recorded phone calls, conversations Seth had no idea were being monitored. And in them, he contradicted himself again and again. He whined, he plotted, he lied, he was always lying, and the moment police would disprove one version of events, he'd just invent a new one. Then came the stunt that had jurors visibly wincing, his alleged kidnapping. After learning he was the focus of the investigation, Seth had actually claimed that he'd been abducted by 2 mysterious men in a van. He said they'd hit him over the head, covered his face with a plastic bag, and threatened to kill his grandmother if he kept speaking to the media. There were no bruises, no evidence, nothing. He was found injured, I say that lightly, in a gutter, and he had this plastic bag beside him. It was complete bullshit and everyone knew it. And the defense really didn't have much to kind of retort with. In fact, they had a witness, but that was Seth. He took the stand and tried to charm the jury. He admitted that he'd lied about his first alibi, but only because he'd been embarrassed about being with a sex worker. And this came out at trial, what he earlier told a psychiatrist. He said, "I have deep remorse for people I lied to, but they can't make me plead guilty to murder." So at this point, he's admitting he lied, but not that he's murdered. Even his own family members had stopped defending him. His aunt Emily said that she was terrified of him, and his grandmother Amelita was so concerned for her own safety that she opposed his bail. On May 20th, 2004, after just a month of testimony, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on all 3 counts. Seth was stunned. His expression froze in disbelief, like he truly couldn't fathom how the world had failed to recognise his performance for the masterpiece he thought it was. Outside the courtroom, his aunt, Annie, said, "I just feel that we have lost another member of the family. We're really in pain. I think justice has been done, but it would have been easier to accept if it were a different person. I just wish it wasn't him." Before sentencing, Seth was required to undergo a full psychiatric assessment, and Professor David Greenberg, a seasoned forensic psychiatrist and professor of psychiatry, did extensive evaluation and found no evidence of any mental illness that would explain or mitigate Seth's actions. Nothing. Not even the long-shot theory that Seth had repressed trauma from surviving the 1990 Luzon earthquake. Basically, he'd once been briefly trapped in rubble. That's how it's reported, by the way, briefly trapped in rubble during the earthquake. But the professor found no evidence of PTSD or anything else because of that. Just lies. Even in the psychological interviews, he showed no genuine remorse, only frustration that no one was buying his story. He told his grandmother in court, "If you don't think I'm feeling any pain, you're wrong. Whatever pain you're feeling, I am feeling it much worse than you." That wasn't remorse, that was narcissism in full bloom, and the court saw it. On September 18th, 2004, the day after Seth turned 24, he was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge said Seth had failed to accept responsibility, showed no insight into the enormity of his crimes, and lacked any genuine remorse. He would die in prison. And with that, Seth Gonzales, known as the baby-faced wannabe pop star with the elaborate fantasies and pathological lies, was officially branded a triple murderer. The case didn't end with that sentence though. In fact, the shockwaves of the Gonzales murders changed real estate laws in New South Wales. So when the home on Collins Street, the site of the murders, when that went up for sale, the real estate agent didn't actually disclose the crime to prospective buyers. The property sold in 2005 for $720,000, and the new owners had no idea what had happened in what they thought was their beautiful, new, very well-priced home. When the truth emerged, they were devastated. One of them told a news outlet, "I get really annoyed when people ask about what happened here because it happened before us. I know the Gonzaleses were a good family and would have liked to know we've taken over their home and have been happy here." But the damage was done, and the public outcry because of this house sale going through was huge. As a direct result, the New South Wales government introduced new legislation making it illegal for agents to conceal information that could significantly impact the value of a property, which obviously included murders. The Gonzales house became a legal turning point. Anyway, throughout this case, and especially getting to the kind of end of the research, I think I've concluded that Seth wasn't driven by rage or desperation or revenge. He was driven by ego. He wasn't just a liar, he was a pathological liar. A man who couldn't stop inventing realities where he was admired or envied. In the months leading up to the murders, Seth had created a whole fictional life. He told friends that he had cancer. He claimed to be this famous musician. He obviously made that fake fan website dedicated to himself. And he invented that girlfriend who died in the 9/11 attacks. Seth didn't just lie. He really lived inside of those lies. Psychologists describe this type of behaviour as narcissistic fantasy formation, a coping mechanism where individuals will create alternate realities where they're powerful, admired and heroic, which I am a big Buffy fan. There is an episode of this where a character called Jonathan, who is kind of known as a bit of a geek, a bit of a loser and a bit of a loner, there's a whole episode where that's what he does. He is this person who is powerful and admired and heroic when in reality that is just a fantasy. Now, in this case, in Seth's case, when that fantasy is threatened, when reality intrudes, it can trigger narcissistic rage. And in Seth's case, that rage, driven by ego, was lethal. And his family had seen through the fantasy. He'd been outed as faking his own university grades, and his parents were on the verge of cutting him off financially and taking away the car he loved so much. So in response to that, he just erased them. For Seth, the murders were the ultimate power play, a way to completely reset the narrative and reclaim control and cast himself as a victim. In 2007, Seth was granted the right to appeal his conviction, arguing that police had not properly cautioned him during his initial interviews. The court rejected the appeal. His life sentence stood, and the judges found no miscarriage of justice had occurred. Today, Seth Gonzales remains in prison. He has never confessed, never shown genuine remorse, and continues to protest his innocence. But no amount of denial can hide the truth. His lies unravelled and this fantasy world collapsed, and a family, vibrant, hard-working, deeply loved, was wiped from the earth by one of its own.